We live in the Bay Area where you go to San Francisco, you have CEOs at age 25, and then you have 60-year-olds on their skateboards going down the hills of San Francisco. And you say, what's going on there? I mean, this is kind of bizarre.
Our Bay Area innovator today is Dr. Robert Harrison, the Rosina Pierrotti Professor of Italian Literature at Stanford University. In 2014, he was given the title of Chevalier, or Knight, by the French Republic. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the author of several books, including one we will be discussing today, Juvenescence.
The greatest blessing a society can confer on its young is to turn them into the heirs rather than the orphans of history. I think it's a terrible age to be young.
He also hosts a 20-year-old podcast on Stanford's KZSU radio called Entitled Opinions and nicknamed the Narcotic of Intelligent Conversations. This is Bay Area Innovators, and I'm your host, Steve Espas. Professor Harrison, welcome to our program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's awesome to have you here. So I'd like to talk to you about Italian literature. And first, I want to ask you, my opinion is that we have Italian opera, the works of art found in France, as pretty much the highlight of this civilization, the pinnacle of civilization. Now, you're intimately familiar with both cultures. I want to ask you about your thoughts and what makes Italian literature special.
So Italian literature is a canon that is quite unusual because it's composed not only of literary writers, but the scientists, the great scientists of the Italian tradition were also writers. And they're studied in Italian departments as part of the canon. Galileo, for example, who belongs mostly to the physics department, was an extraordinary writer. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo.
That's amazing. Yeah, we don't even think of them as literature writers.
No, but many of even the more modern scientists like Alessandro Volta, who was so important, for in electricity, was a poet as well. And then when you look at the more literary figures, people like Dante, who wrote the Divine Comedy, he was much more than a poet. He also was at the vanguard of the astronomy of the Middle Ages, the physics and the architecture. So his Divine Comedy brings in almost like an encyclopedic knowledge of all the arts and sciences of his time. So to teach Italian literature is really to be really at the core of the Western canon. And what's ironic is that the Italian departments of literature in American universities tend to be very small and very marginal, but that's because it's like the body of Italian literature has been dismembered into different body parts. So you find, for example, as I mentioned, Galileo will belong to the Department of Physics. Machiavelli, whom we study also as a literary writer, belongs to political science. St. Francis and the other saints in religious studies. Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci in art history. So in a certain sense, the body of Italian literature is dispersed across many different fields and disciplines. And that's what makes it so rewarding to be a teacher of Italian literature, because you can venture
combine them, bring them all together.
Bring them all together, right. Science and the imagination have always gone together in the Italian canon. And I even serve not just as a model of the past, but also for the future, because I think we've gotten to the point where that lesson of bringing science and the imagination together is becoming more and more necessary with the new sciences that we're living with.
How do you get your students hooked up on these amazing topics in literature? How do you get them excited about it?
Yeah, I think the first order of business is to pay close attention to the texts that we're reading and to expose and bring to light the fascination and the complexity and the insights that these works contain. and a way of activating what, for me, is always the currency of literature. I think love is the currency of education and learning. That if you don't love mathematics, you're not going to become a really good mathematician. If you don't love literature, you're not going to succeed to the same degree in the learning process. And in fact, the word study goes back to the Latin word studium, which has this archaic meaning of zeal, desire, eagerness, and therefore it's associated with love. So I think by activating the love of a topic is the way to get students fully immersed in the topic that they're studying. It's not easy, but when it works well.
Is there, can you talk to us, is there a connection between Italian opera and Italian literature?
Oh yeah.
And I gotta say that, you know, my all-time favorite piece of Italian opera is the 1994 performance at the Three Tenors concert in Los Angeles by Luciano Pavarotti, where he sang Nessun Dorma. And you know, some opera buffs would say that that's not real opera. You know, it's more made for, you know, for public to like opera. But that's still my all-time favorite. So
that's the aria from Nessun Dorma that was sung at the opening of the World Cup.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And I think in 1990 was the first time he did it solo.
Yes.
In 1994 he did it in that. The
He was
tenors.
with the three of them, but I think it's still solo, but
Right.
the others are there as well.
That's right, yeah. Well, okay, so opera is part of the history of Italian literature, and I've taught it often in the surveys of Italian literature, because the more you look into it, the more you realize that the people who started opera were enthusiasts of antiquity, Greek and Roman antiquity. Aristotle, his book on the Poetics had been recently discovered, and they were reading Aristotle, and they misunderstood Aristotle when he said that the parts of Greek tragedy were sung both by the actors and by the chorus, right? Now, we know that that's not true, that the choral odes in Greek tragedy were sung, but if it's Oedipus or Antigone, and these lines were actually spoken and not sung, they were under the mistaken impression that the whole thing was sung. And in this typical Renaissance desire to imitate the ancients, they came up and wrote what they thought were tragedies in the old Greek way, and it turned into that they were sung. And the Camerata was the musical group. Galileo's father, Vincenzo Galileo, was one of the first people to create music for the first Italian opera. I think it was Orpheus. So the libretti are literary. The arias that you're referring to, I think it's the character is it's part of a larger story and a drama, and yeah. So Italian opera is certainly part of the Italian canon.
Next, I want to move on to your French connection.
Yes.
You've been awarded in 2014 the title of Chevalier, which means a knight, by the French Republic. Can you please tell us the background? How did you get this? How did the French Republic give you this title?
Right. So the Chevalier is given to people when it comes to foreigners who have made a specific contribution to the diffusion of French culture beyond its own national boundaries. I do French literature as well as Italian. I'm a professor of both French and Italian literature. I was the chairman of my department of French and Italian at Stanford University for 7 years. And in that capacity, I sponsored a number of events, conferences, and other sort of activities that were promoting French literary intellectual culture. Two of my colleagues were members of the French Academy, Michel Serres, René Girard, and all of my books have been published in French, and I've given lectures at the Collège de France in France, and I came to the attention of the people of the Chevalier Committee of the Arts and Letters, and someone nominated me, and I received this knighthood, if you want to call it that.
Congratulations.
Thank
That's
you.
a
Thank
a fantastic title to have, especially outside of France. But
It's the one I'm most proud of, Chevalier de la République Française.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. So I'd like to bring up one of your books, the Juvenescence, and I read it. It's an amazing book. I don't do drugs or anything like that, but as I go through the book, I almost feel like a strong dose of caffeine, and I feel like it's very thought-provoking and it's very interesting. The first thing I want to ask you about is, in the beginning of the book, you talk about how our society is obsessed with creating the best for the youth, for the young people, and at the same time is waging a war against the young people by depraving them of many things in today's society, including being outdoors, enjoying nature, enjoying the past. Tell us about that. Tell us about your thoughts.
So this book, Juvenescence, the subtitle is A Cultural History of Our Age. So our age is our historical age on the one hand, but also how old are we in this historical age that we belong to? Because I'm convinced that in the Western world, at least, in the first world, we are far younger in mentality, lifestyles, behavior, and our looks than even a generation or two ago. If you read Balzac, the French author, 19th century French author, earlier 19th century, he wrote a book called La Femme de 30 ans, the woman of 30, the 30-year-old woman, in which he was trying to make a case that a 30-year-old woman's life is not necessarily over at all, that she still has things to look forward to. A 30-year-old woman today on the tennis courts at Stanford or something looks more like the daughter than the sister, let's say, of Balzac's thing. You look at pictures from the past. I even look at my father's yearbook, and when he was in high school, all these faces look like adults. And when I compare them to the undergraduates that I have at Stanford, I mean, the undergraduates look really like children. They still are children. And therefore, this is what I mean by juvenescence, that as we get older as a history and as a society, because we go back 2,000 years, we're at least 3,000 years old as a culture, we are in the process of also getting younger in many ways. We have a much more youthful culture than ever in history. So that, combined with this kind of exaltation and worship of youth, we live in a society where youth has become the model of emulation for the elders. This is a momentous cultural revolution. I mean, never before that I know of have the young served as the model for the older people. It's always been
the other way
around. The young were always in a hurry to grow up because all the privileges and all the benefits and all the authority lay with adulthood. Now, older people are trying to hold on to their youth as much as they can. So this is a huge cultural paradigmatic shift in our culture. And so you would think that a culture that has this obsession with youth would be particularly favorable towards the young. But I claim that that is not the case at all. And if you'd like, I would, with your permission, I'll read just a little passage from the book where I write that we do not promote the cause of youth when we infantilize rather than educate desire, and then capitalize on its bad infinity, nor when we shatter the relative stability of the world on which cultural identity depends, nor when we oblige the young to inhabit a present without historical depth or density. The greatest blessing a society can confer on its young is to turn them into the heirs rather than the orphans of history. It is also the greatest blessing a society can confer on itself, for heirs rejuvenate the heritage by creatively renewing its legacies. Orphans, by contrast, relate to the past as an alien, unapproachable continent. If they relate to it at all, our age seems intent on turning the world as a whole into an orphanage for reasons that no one, least of all the author of this book, truly understands. So I think it's a terrible age to be young, strangely enough, because what the young need, above all, is a certain kind of safety. They need a lot of leisure time. They need, youth is nourished by access to nature, the wonder of nature and the natural world. And you have to be free to fail time and again. It's a learning process, failure. But it seems that we live in a society where none of these things are as readily available to the young as they used to be. Certainly our detachment from nature and the fact that now young people in the first world are living within the miniature world of their cell phone screens. I mean, this is not fruitful for the spirit of youth. It ages you very quickly now.
Not to mention other worse habits of addiction and missing school and stay up all night playing games and whatever.
Well, exactly, yeah. So I part of my book, Juvenescence, is about this strange paradox that on the one hand, we worship youth, on the other hand, we seem not to do very much to promote the spirit of youthfulness among the young.
And on that note, I would even argue that we might be the last generation that even realizes the deprivation the youth has. In the future, they may not even think that, what outdoors, or what anything else other than the screen.
Right. I think you're right. When you deprive a generation or two of something, they eventually forget about its existence. And if you're not, as I mentioned earlier, you're not allowed to fail because, one bad year, you're not going to get into Harvard, you're not going to get into Yale, you're not going to, I think that we're not going to, the future generations might not even be aware of what has been lost in this process of juvenescence.
In chapter 2, you talk about the beautiful depiction of Plato's description of Atlantis, of the fall of Atlantis. And again, that's one of my favorite historical tales, Is Plato the only one who talks about Atlantis, or are there others?
The story comes from him, yes.
Yes. So that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Tell us about that. Tell us about, not the story itself, but you bring up the volcano, and the river and the volcano. And what do you mean by that?
So Plato tells the story of Atlantis, this civilization which was very old, but that disappeared, it sank into the sea, as a way of saying that Greece has a very long history, because it was the ancient civilization of Atlantis that gave rise to the Greek society, but that they have forgotten all about it. So in a certain sense, they are very old, but when Solon, the lawgiver of Greece, goes to Egypt, it takes the Egyptian priest to say, "Oh, Solon, you Greeks are nothing but children, you've always been," because you keep losing your memory, you keep losing your historical memory, and therefore you don't even remember how old your culture is. Whereas in Egypt, we have a historical memory that has been continuous for many generations. That's what I mean by the river. The river flows and it's continuous, and the Nile River is the emblem of this continuity between the generations. The priest and the sage tells Solon there that the difference between Egypt and Greece is that Greece, because of its geography, is subjected to periodic calamities and disasters because the heavenly declinations, it's really climate issues that relevant to our own time. The water and floods come from above, from the sky, whereas in Egypt, the floods come from beneath the ground. It's the flooding of the Nile he's talking about. And that when these heavenly declinations periodically come and wash away, the cities, that the Greeks end up losing all of their culture and their cultural memory, and they have to begin again as children. And this is Plato's way of explaining why Greek culture is actually a very youthful culture. And the reason, so I call that the difference between the river and the volcano. The volcano erupts periodically in Greece, everything is destroyed, the memory is lost, and you begin again. The volcano versus the river, where you remember deep historical, generational time. I wanted to write that chapter on the difference between an old tradition-based society that has continuity versus a young, discontinuous culture like Greece, because when I look for a precedent historically for a youthful culture like the American culture in particular, I find in Greece the antecedent to that, because the Greeks were, from many points of view, a kind of youth-oriented society. Now, does that help? Does that edify us at all? I'm not sure, because those calamities that Plato is describing, one can say that they are taking place in our own day and age, that we are in the process of losing our cultural and historical memory as we speak, not because of the heavenly declinations and storms and so forth, but because our the things that we were speaking about earlier, there's a way in which the historical past is becoming an alien country to us. The institutions that guarantee continuity between the generations has succumbed to ruptures. In America, you don't have hardly anymore these intergenerational households where children are growing up not only with their parents but with their grandparents. And how does the transmission of culture and traditions and rituals, how does it take place? It starts in the household, it starts at home, and where you have this sort of generational segregation, where the children are segregated in their schools and then on their cell phones. The parents of the children are segregated in the workplace, and the grandparents in old people's homes or some other place. It's very hard if you're a young person to receive the wisdom of the elders.
Yes.
And then when you go to the classroom in grade school and high school, nowadays the teachers don't want to talk about the past, because even the teachers have largely forgotten about the deep past. They want to talk about the problems of the present. So this presentism, which is the dominant ideology of our time, also conspires to collapse and destroy cultural memory, the deep cultural memory of the past. So and that's another way in which I think the young of today are getting a very raw deal, because everything conspires to make them the orphans rather than the heirs of a long tradition in history.
What I thought it's fascinating about the comparisons and about the Atlantis story that you mentioned was that you mentioned the heavenly declinations, that the sages at the time were saying the reason for this catastrophe. And also you mentioned how internally the society at that time was getting heavy, or was losing virtue or morality, and that was the reason. And I thought maybe the reason is both, really. Maybe the heavenly declinations created this void in society in some way, on a psyche that's not measurable easily. But any thoughts on that?
Yes, it's very hard to distinguish between natural disasters and social disasters. Oftentimes, what we call natural disasters are the consequence of social mismanagement. And therefore, when you have plagues or the Spanish flu, influenza, which killed millions of people in the world, it wasn't because all of a sudden nature just unleashed a Spanish flu. It was because of World War I and the conditions in the army camps and things of that sort. So oftentimes it's the disasters of history which create natural disasters. I think you're right to say that it goes both ways. Our loss of cultural memory creates the conditions for also certain natural disasters.
You make another excellent point in the book, I think. It's how old do we really are? If someone is 60 years old, is it the body, the mind, or the soul? And then indeed we look at the older people that act like kids and some really young people that seem very mature, and
Yeah.
I ran into these kids into my son's school. And Einstein himself, he was like a kid all his life. He was questioning all these things. So tell us about that. And also I want to ask you, do you believe in reincarnation? Because that would explain the soul is one age, but when you're born in a different body at different periods in time, the soul is that age, but the body could be different ages.
Right.
I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Reincarnation would explain a lot of weird phenomena for sure. When Einstein was asked about, where your genius, where did it come from? And he said, my scientific mind is one that never stopped asking childlike questions. Simple questions like, when children ask, why is the sky blue? What would the world look like if you were traveling on a beam of light at the speed of light? And he's not alone. I think science is intrinsically a rather juvenile practice. Why do I say that? Is because science is always looking to the future. It does not have a memory of what it learned. There are departments called the history of science, but they don't have nothing to do with science. The scientific journals, a theorem that's 10 years old has gone into oblivion. So science is always looking with wonder, like a child with open eyes at phenomena, and is intrigued by what makes them work and then trying to find answers. It's not by chance that many of the geniuses in the scientific world, especially in mathematics, are very young. I think in mathematics, after the age of 25, 26 years, the plasticity of the mind, it makes it much more difficult to make breakthroughs at the mathematical level. So yes, science is part of this juvenescence that I'm talking about. What you mentioned earlier, it's exactly right. We live in the Bay Area where you go to San Francisco, you have CEOs at age 25 running really big companies, and then you have 60-year-olds on their skateboards going down the hills of San Francisco. And you say, what's going on there? I mean, this is kind of bizarre. But indeed, the question, how old are we, is a very difficult one to answer because age is such a complex phenomenon with very many different dimensions. My biological age, your biological age, that's, we know I was born in a certain year, I'm certain amount of years old. But every atom in your body, every atom in my body is as old as the universe itself. That means that I'm 70 years old plus
billions of years.
14 billion years. I'm 70 plus 14 billion years. I belong to a society of in the Western world. And, it's one thing I tell my students that if I'm going to teach them, for example, something about Italian Renaissance or the past, that you may be 18 or 20 years old, but by the end of the 10 weeks of this course, you're going to be 500, maybe 2,000 years older than you are now, because you are going to take on the cultural age of centuries, if not millennia. And then, of course, what you were mentioning, that each individual seems to be born into a particular kind of age that persists throughout the life. So some people have a kind of wise elderly temperament when they're young, and others are childlike even in their most senior years. If you take a band like Pink Floyd, even late in their careers, or when they're in it's still the adolescence. It's the emotion of adolescence which is brought into their music. It's about being alienated from society, that ill at ease. It's a protest against the mothers and the fathers. So this sort of persistence in certain age categories is very interesting. I was always told that I was born old. Freshman in college, I would take a girlfriend for have sandwiches in the cemetery because I felt, at home among the dead. And I've always felt at home among the dead. And that's maybe why I became a professor of literature, because what is literature? You are constantly in conversation with dead voices. These voices that come to you from books are the voices of the dead that are speaking across a threshold. So every one of us has a particular age temperament, I would say. And is it maybe a product of reincarnation of how old we were, or how many times we've been? I don't know. I can only, I can't speculate that far, but there's something to it. I see why you make that connection.
There's something you mentioned that Socrates said. He said something like, truth doesn't always represent justice. And the reason is that because he gives some examples when that's not the case. It's a very rare example that you have to lie to do the right thing. It's an outside case. I want to ask you about that because I feel that he's a sage, of course. He's a philosopher. He's one of the top scientists. But in this particular case, I feel he's going into a dead end in the sense that truth should represent justice. But if you have one specific case where it doesn't, this should not pretty much alienate or take away this statement. So I just wonder if any thoughts on that.
Socrates is a creature of paradox and contradiction, no doubt about it. And when he insists so much that his vocation as a philosopher is to arrive at the truth, it becomes extremely ironic that he has these exceptions. So when Plato writes the Republic, which is all about the philosopher king who is in possession of the truth, and because he's in possession of the truth, is rightfully should be the leader and the dictator of the city, he says that we have to tell, in order to create the ideal republic, we have to tell a noble lie, which is that children are not born of their biological parents, they're born of the state. And this noble lie will enable the ideal republic to function all the more efficiently. And you say, well, what's going on there? The Plato and Socrates, who devote their lives to the pursuit of truth, are saying that the ideal republic has to rest on a noble lie. And sometimes these lies can be pernicious. I mean, we know what happens when the state feels entitled to tell these noble lies for its own self-serving purposes, right?
Yes.
So these are moments in Plato's dialogues and in the character of Socrates that I really don't know what to do with. But what I can say about Socrates also in relation to the theme of Juvenescence is that we were talking about the age temperament. He preserved a youthful attitude and temperament throughout his older years. And therefore he was able to relate to the youth of Athens because he was very much their age, but an older version of their age. And they loved him. His disciples loved him because he had the same sort of passion, the erotic passion, and this heroism of knowledge. These young men of Athens were eager to enter into a future and discover truths and expand their horizons. And he was, as he said, the midwife of it because he would not act his age. That's why he was a good teacher. The teacher is somehow in between youth and older age, and therefore can serve as someone who can induct the young into stages of life that are beyond them. So it takes, I think, a good teacher like Socrates was, for no doubt about it. It takes this commitment to remaining youthful in spirit, because if you surrender the youthful spirit, it's very hard to inspire that love in students that I talked about at the beginning of our interview.
Professor Harrison, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
We're going to end the first episode here and would love to have you back next week to continue with our story.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you for watching another episode of Bay Area Innovators. If you enjoyed this episode and you know someone who should be on our show, please send us an email at sfbay@epochtimes.com. We would love to hear from you. Thank you and see you next week.